Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the hidden lives of medieval women, those often overlooked figures who held families, farms, convents, and even entire estates together when no one was watching. Before we get comfortable, take a second to like this video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy what we're doing here. And in the comments, share where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we think of medieval history, we're often handed a story painted with knights in gleaming armor, kings perched on high thrones, and monks scratching away at their manuscripts in candlelit scriptoria. Women, if they appear at all, are usually cast as background figures, noble ladies in embroidered gowns, or peasants with baskets of bread. But behind those images lay full, complex lives. Medieval women were workers, caretakers, healers, teachers, and sometimes leaders. Their days were filled with rhythms of labor, devotion, and survival, quietly shaping the world in ways that rarely made it into chronicles written by men. Let's take a moment to picture the world into which a medieval woman was born. The year might be 1250. In a small village somewhere in northern France, or along the damp fields of England, or in the hilly landscapes of Tuscany, a child cries out in a thatched hut. It's a girl. Her arrival is greeted with both joy and trepidation. Joy, because every life was precious in a time when infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Trepidation, because daughters meant dowries one day, and mothers and fathers knew the weight of arranging their child's future. From her very first breath, the path of this girl was often guided not by her own choices, but by custom, family needs, and the expectations of her community. For some, that path meant a future in a convent, tucked behind cloister walls, serving God and the rhythm of monastic bells. For others, it meant long days bent over fields, hands raw from labor, or hours at a loom, weaving cloth for survival and for trade. For noble daughters, it meant a future of alliances, marriages brokered between families, lands exchanged, fortunes sealed with vows. But across all classes, what united these women was resilience. They lived without the luxuries of privacy, choice, or comfort as we understand them today, and yet they carried on often with remarkable ingenuity. When a medieval woman rose in the morning, she was stepping into a world shaped by restrictions, but also by quiet freedoms. She might begin her day by tending a fire, coaxing it to life with embers banked under ash the night before. The hearth was her domain, and in many ways the center of her world. It warmed her family, cooked their food, and kept away the creeping cold. With little more than a few scraps of wood and perhaps dried peat, she could transform a bleak winter morning into one just a little more bearable. Beyond her home, she moved through spaces often invisible to chroniclers. Fields, gardens, markets, spinning rooms, kitchens and chapels were places where women's presence was constant and indispensable. While knights were away on campaign, or monks cloistered in scriptoria, women held villages together with their labor. And it wasn't only about survival. Women created small moments of beauty in hard lives. They embroidered altar cloths with bright threads, sang lullabies to restless infants, and tended herb gardens where color and scent softened the grayness of subsistence. They passed down recipes, remedies, and whispered charms, knowledge that blended medicine, folklore, and faith into the daily fabric of life. To step into the hidden life of medieval women is to peel back layers of silence in the historical record. These were lives lived in shadows cast by castles and cathedrals. But shadows can be fertile places. In those spaces grew resilience, resourcefulness, and subtle forms of power. A wife's quiet management of her household might mean the difference between hunger and survival. A nun's discipline in her scriptorium might preserve entire libraries of knowledge. A peasant girl's labor in the fields ensured harvests that sustained her entire community. The Chronicles of Kings rarely paused to notice these women, but the endurance of medieval society itself rested on their shoulders. Tonight, we'll walk with them. We'll see their daily lives, their hardships and joys, their small triumphs, and the remarkable strength that kept families and communities alive. Our story begins not with queens or saints, but with the ordinary girl of a medieval village. The world she opened her eyes to, the duties she learned as soon as she could walk, and the expectations that shaped her from her earliest years. Because to understand medieval women, we must first understand how girlhood began. Imagine the earliest years of a medieval girl's life. From the moment she was old enough to toddle, her world was shaped by the rhythms of her household. Childhood, as we think of it today, with toys, long hours of play, and years of schooling, was not really a concept in the Middle Ages. For girls, especially, childhood was brief and filled with expectation. In a peasant village, a little girl might spend her first few years under her mother's watchful eye, often strapped to her back or seated on the ground nearby as her mother worked. Babies were swaddled tightly, wrapped in long strips of cloth that kept their limbs firm and straight, an old practice believed to ensure healthy growth. Toddlers soon learned to imitate adult tasks, carrying small bundles of sticks, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon, or helping scatter grain for chickens. Play and work blended together, because learning survival skills began almost as soon as a child could walk. A noble girl's early years looked somewhat different, but the essence was the same: preparation for responsibility. In a castle, she might have a nursemaid to tend her needs, and perhaps even a wet nurse if her mother was occupied or had many children. Toys could include carved wooden dolls or small balls, but these were not meant for long indulgence. Very quickly, noble girls were guided toward learning the behaviors expected of them, sitting still, speaking politely, and beginning to learn the symbols of faith through prayer and practice. The church bell, tolling across fields and towns, was the steady heartbeat of medieval childhood. From infancy, girls were raised in the rhythm of religion: morning prayers, feast days, saints' festivals, and the long cycle of Lent and Advent. They might not have understood the words at first, but the sounds of chants and the smell of incense became the backdrop of their earliest memories. And while boys were often apprenticed to trades or trained in arms, girls were apprenticed to womanhood. Their teachers were usually their mothers, grandmothers, or older sisters. A girl of 5 or 6 might already know how to card wool, fetch water from a well, or grind grain in a heavy quernstone. She might be trusted to rock a cradle or soothe a younger sibling. In families where survival was precarious, even the smallest hands were needed. Not all girlhoods were equal, of course. A daughter of a merchant in a bustling town might have slightly more opportunities, perhaps learning her letters or assisting in keeping household accounts. Daughters of nobility might learn to embroider with silk threads, to play a stringed instrument, or to dance with careful grace. A convent school might teach noble girls Latin prayers, reading, and music. Yet even these opportunities were framed not as paths to independence, but as ways to make a girl more suitable for marriage or religious life. For the majority of peasant girls, however, literacy was rare. Instead, their education came through stories, songs, and oral traditions. Around a smoky hearth, they listened to folk tales passed down through generations, sometimes laced with quiet lessons about caution, resourcefulness, or virtue. These stories were not just entertainment, they were memory banks of cultural wisdom, a way for mothers to pass guidance to daughters in a world where books were scarce. Childhood also carried dangers. Illness was a constant shadow, and girls were no more shielded from it than boys. A sudden fever, a winter of poor harvest, or an outbreak of disease could cut short a life before it had truly begun. But in the face of such fragility, families cherished small joys: laughter at a puppet show during a fair, a cluster of wildflowers gathered on a spring day, or the shared warmth of siblings huddled together on a straw bed during winter nights. It's worth pausing to remember. Though life was hard, medieval childhood was not without tenderness. Mothers sang lullabies, some of which still echo in folk traditions. Today, fathers carved little wooden trinkets for their daughters, and in fields, young girls could chase each other barefoot, laughing with the same delight that children everywhere know, even when their games were short-lived before chores called them back. By the time a girl reached her early teens, however, childhood was essentially over. At 12 or 13, many girls were considered ready for the responsibilities of womanhood. In practice, that meant marriage arrangements for noble daughters, or heavier workloads for peasant ones. A girl's worth was increasingly measured by the skills she had mastered. Could she keep a household, prepare food, spin thread, tend a garden, or serve at table with grace? Some were even sent away from their families at this age, noble girls, to serve in another household as part of their social training, peasant girls to work as servants for wealthier neighbours or townsfolk. This leaving was often bittersweet, filled with both pride and sorrow. So, medieval girlhood was less a time apart, and more a gentle slope into womanhood, guided by the tasks of the home and the unspoken rules of society. It was a training ground, one that shaped daughters into wives, mothers, nuns, or workers, each destined to take up her place in the wider web of medieval life. And as we step further into this story, we'll follow those young girls into the next stage, education, or, for most, the absence of it, and how that shaped the possibilities of their futures. When we think of education, we often picture rows of children seated with slates or parchment, guided by a stern teacher. In the medieval world, however, education was uneven, limited, and deeply shaped by class and gender. For boys, there were paths into cathedral schools, apprenticeships, or even universities, if they came from wealthy families. For girls, the story was much more complicated. For the vast majority of peasant girls, formal schooling simply did not exist. Literacy was rare, and survival skills were considered far more essential than letters on a page. A girl's education came instead from her home and her village. She learned by watching, by listening, and by doing. Her teachers were mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and neighbours who showed her how to tend a garden, preserve food, weave baskets, or mend clothes. Knowledge was handed down orally, in gestures and stories, not written texts. Still, this doesn't mean medieval women were ignorant. Their education simply followed different priorities. A peasant girl might not have been able to read the Psalms, but she knew which herbs could soothe a burn, how to spin flax into thread, and when to plant crops by the turning of the seasons. Her learning was practical, rooted in the rhythms of survival, and often far more hands-on than that of many men cloistered with books. Among the nobility, education opened slightly wider doors. A noble daughter might be taught to read and write, especially if she was destined for a convent. Latin, the language of the church, was considered essential for religious life, and some young women who entered convent schools became highly literate. They copied manuscripts, composed music, and even wrote spiritual texts that still survive today. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen or Heloise remind us that when women had access to education, they could produce extraordinary work. But for most noble girls, the focus was not on books, but on accomplishments suited to their role in society. They learned to embroider, to sing and play instruments, to manage servants, and to maintain a household with grace. Dancing, etiquette, and even a little astronomy or herbal knowledge might be included, not for curiosity's sake, but to prepare them to be suitable wives and companions. A noble woman was expected to be cultivated, but not so educated as to overshadow her husband. In towns, the daughters of merchants sometimes had unique opportunities. With trade expanding in the later Middle Ages, literacy became useful for keeping accounts, reading letters, or managing shops. In certain families, daughters worked alongside their fathers, learning numbers and letters out of necessity. There are records of women in cities like Florence, Ghent, and London who became skilled businesswomen, some even running enterprises in textiles, brewing, or trade after their husbands' deaths. For them, education was not a luxury, but a tool of livelihood. Convents offered the clearest path for women seeking intellectual life. Within their walls, nuns could devote themselves to reading scripture, illuminating manuscripts, and composing music. Some convents maintained libraries that rivaled those of monasteries, and their abbesses wielded significant cultural influence. For women who entered these communities, education was tied to devotion, but it also provided rare space for creativity and scholarship. Yet these were exceptions. Most women lived and died without reading a single book. The church, which dominated thought, often warned against too much learning for women, fearing it could lead to dangerous independence. Instead, women were encouraged to learn prayers by heart, to absorb sermons, and to live their faith through obedience. Oral tradition songs, proverbs, and folk tales became their classroom. Still, within these constraints, women found ways to pass knowledge to one another. Herbal remedies, childbirth techniques, and household management were all part of an informal education system, kept alive from generation to generation. Mothers whispered secrets to daughters, midwives trained apprentices, and wise women held a store of healing knowledge that communities depended upon. It is striking to imagine how many women's voices never reached the page simply because they were denied the tools of writing. How many songs, poems, and reflections disappeared with them, carried only in memory. And yet, their influence lingered in the skills they taught, the children they raised, and the knowledge they passed on quietly, without fanfare. So, while education for medieval women was limited, it was never absent. It was simply shaped by what society allowed, and by what families needed to survive. Some few noble or religious women managed to step beyond those boundaries, leaving us writings that echo across centuries. Most, however, left no written trace. Their legacy lives in the invisible web of practical knowledge that held communities together, and as girls grew into women, they carried this learning into the daily rhythm of their lives, which leads us to their work, not the grand gestures remembered in chronicles, but the ordinary labour that sustained homes, fields, and entire villages. Step into a medieval village at dawn, and you'll find women already at work. Long before the sun cleared the horizon, they were tending fires, milking animals, preparing food, and setting the rhythm for the day. The work of peasant women was constant, demanding, and rarely acknowledged in the chronicles of kings and nobles, but it was their labour that kept villages alive. A peasant woman's tasks shifted with the seasons. In spring, she helped sow crops, scattering seed across furrows while balancing a child on her hip. In summer, she weeded and gathered herbs, her hands stained with soil, and her back bent from long hours in the fields. Autumn meant harvest, when entire families worked together to bring in the grain. Women tied bundles of wheat, shook flax for fibres, or gathered apples and nuts for storage. In winter, she turned to indoor work, spinning flax or wool, patching clothes, and preparing food from whatever had been stored away. Housework and fieldwork overlapped constantly. A woman might spend her morning mending a roof of thatch, then dash inside to stir pottage simmering over the hearth. She might knead coarse barley dough with one hand while keeping an eye on children or an elderly parent. Every task was urgent because survival depended on nothing being wasted. No time, no food, no strength. The village itself often reflected women's labour. Paths were swept by their hands, wells kept clean by their watch, and animals tended under their care. They managed vegetable plots close to home, planting beans, leeks, onions, and herbs that flavoured and preserved food. These gardens were vital. Without them, winter diets would have been even leaner. reduced to little more than stale bread and weak ale, and while men often took the heavier ploughing and haymaking, women were the ones who kept households supplied daily. They collected eggs, churned butter, brewed ale, and wove cloth. Brewing, in fact, was so closely tied to women's work that for centuries, alewives managed much of the local production. Brewing ale was not just a task but an economic lifeline. Women brewed for their families and sold the excess, earning small but vital incomes. Women also played essential roles in animal care. Sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens were often managed by women and children. Feeding, milking, and tending these animals was woven into the rhythm of the day. Their presence inside homes, goats tied in corners, chickens roosting in rafters reminded everyone of how closely human and animal survival were linked. The marketplace gave another glimpse into women's economic roles. On market days, women carried baskets of eggs, cheese, herbs, or spun thread into town. They traded, haggled, and sold their goods, often standing shoulder to shoulder with men in stalls and streets. Some women became known for their craft-skilled weavers, potters, or bakers whose goods supported entire families. Town records occasionally note women paying fines, signing contracts, or even standing in court, proof that their work gave them standing within their communities, however modest. For all this, women's labour was often invisible to the higher classes. Chroniclers praised knights for bravery and lords for generosity, but rarely did they mention the women who kept entire households running while men fought or worked in fields. Yet without women, no estate, no farm, no village could function, and their labour did not end with daylight. After long days of toil, evenings were spent spinning by the fire, repairing clothes, or preparing for the next day. A woman's work was never truly done. Rest was a rare luxury. Still, many found small moments of fellowship in their labour. Women spun wool together, sharing gossip and songs, while their hands worked the spindles. At markets, they exchanged remedies and recipes. Even hardship was softened by community, by the shared experience of countless women bound by the same rhythms of life. To walk through a medieval village, then, is to see women's work in every corner. Smoke curling from a hearth, rows of vegetables planted by careful hands, baskets of spun yarn drying in the sunday. Their labour was the quiet heartbeat of medieval life. But life for women was not only about survival in the fields and kitchens. The home itself, the space where children were raised, food was prepared, and faith was lived daily, was another world of responsibility and resilience. And that is where our journey will lead next, into the heart of the medieval home, where women's unseen work shaped the lives of everyone around them. If the fields and markets were the public face of a woman's labour, the home was its heart. In the Middle Ages, home didn't mean privacy or comfort, as we might imagine today. It was a crowded, smoky, often damp space that held not just a family, but sometimes animals, tools, and the daily evidence of survival. Yet within these walls, women orchestrated the rhythm of life. Picture a one-room peasant cottage. Its floor is hard-packed earth, swept but never spotless. Smoke curls from a central hearth, with no chimney to guide it cleanly upward, so the air is thick and hazy. A wooden chest holds a family's precious belongings, perhaps a cloak, a pot, or a few metal tools. In one corner, a straw-stuffed mattress offers a rough bed. A goat may be tethered nearby, chickens perched on a beam. This was the domain of the medieval woman, and she made it function as best she could. The hearth was her command post. Here she cooked meals, usually a perpetual pot of pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, or root vegetables, endlessly topped up as ingredients were available. The fire also provided warmth, light, and even fumigation against insects. Women were responsible for keeping this fire alive day after day, carefully banking the embers at night so that the morning would not begin with the struggle of sparking new flames from flint and steel. Around the hearth, women preserved food for leaner months. They salted meat, dried herbs, and stored root vegetables in pits or baskets, lined with straw. Cheese was pressed, butter churned, ale brewed. In a world where famine was never far away, these tasks were not minor, they were lifelines. Clothing, too, was part of household work. A woman spun wool or flax into thread, wove it into cloth, and stitched garments by hand. Clothes were patched again and again until the fabric gave out completely. A mother might spend long evenings by the fire spinning, while her children slept beside her. Every spindle of thread represented hours of labor and the promise of clothing against winter's cold. Children grew up within this space, watching their mothers at work. They learned chores early, carrying wood, gathering rushes to scatter on the floor, or fetching water from the village well. A household was not divided into strict child and adult spaces. Everyone contributed what they could, as soon as they were able. For noble women, the home looked different, but was equally demanding. A lady of a manor or castle oversaw a staff of servants, but the responsibility still lay with her. She directed kitchens, storerooms, and gardens. She ensured that guests were received with proper hospitality, and that the estate ran smoothly in her husband's absence. A noblewoman's household was larger, but the expectations of management were heavy. She was the central figure, ensuring order, provision, and the maintenance of her family's reputation. Hygiene within the home was another quiet burden. Floors were strewn with rushes or straw, which absorbed spills and waste but quickly grew foul. Women refreshed them when they could, adding herbs like lavender or rosemary to mask odors. Water had to be carried, bucket by bucket, from wells or streams, an exhausting task often done several times a day. Laundry meant hours of soaking, scrubbing, and beating clothes in rivers, then hanging them to dry in the wind. Soap, when it existed, was harsh and scarce, often replaced with lye made from ashes. And still, women found ways to bring beauty into their homes. They embroidered small cloths with bright patterns, carved wooden spoons, or painted designs onto pottery. Gardens often included flowers alongside vegetables, for joy as much as for use. Candles, though precious, were lit on feast days to give a soft glow. The medieval home was rarely comfortable, but within its rough walls, women carved out spaces of warmth and care. It is easy to imagine only hardship in these settings. But there was companionship too. Families gathered by the hearth in the evenings, telling stories and singing songs. Women laughed together while spinning or washing clothes at the village stream. Neighbors exchanged gossip as they worked side by side. Even in homes with little, community made life more bearable. The medieval home was, above all, a place of survival, managed by women's constant effort. They balanced food, clothing, health, and care, often with almost no resources beyond their own ingenuity. And though their names were rarely recorded, their work carried entire generations forward. As we step further into this hidden history, we'll turn to another intimate part of women's lives, their clothing and personal comforts, or, more often, discomforts in a world without modern fabrics or conveniences. When we picture medieval clothing, we often imagine flowing gowns, jeweled headpieces, or finely tailored doublets. But for most women, daily dress was far simpler, heavier, and far less comfortable than the art or films suggest. Clothing was not fashion first, it was protection, labor, and identity, all stitched together by women's hands. For peasant women, the foundation of dress was the linen shift, a simple undergarment that touched the skin. Linen, when available, was kinder to the body than wool, softer, easier to wash, and more breathable. Over this shift, women wore a woolen tunic or kirtle, belted at the waist. with long sleeves that could be rolled back during work. These garments were not meant to flatter, they were meant to last. Sturdy, heavy, and often patched. They carried the marks of everyday labor stains from soil, soot from fires, and the wear of years of use. Shoes were rare for many peasants. If a woman owned them, they were simple leather slippers, thin-soled and offering little protection from damp ground or sharp stones. Many women went barefoot through fields and villages, their feet hardened by habit. In winter, scraps of cloth or straw were stuffed inside shoes for warmth, but still the cold seeped through. Laundry was a heavy burden. Clothes were scrubbed with ashes or rough soap, beaten on stones in rivers, and hung in the open air to dry. Linen shifts were washed more often, but woolen garments might go weeks or even months without proper cleaning. The smoky hearth did its part to disguise odours, but the itch of unwashed wool was constant. Head coverings were nearly universal. A married woman was expected to cover her hair as a sign of modesty. This could be a simple linen wimple that wrapped around the head and neck, or a veil pinned to a coif. For peasant women, a plain kerchief tied over the head sufficed, practical for keeping hair out of food or fire. Hair uncovered was often a sign of youth, of maidenhood, or sometimes of impropriety. For noble women, clothing was richer, but not necessarily more comfortable. Their gowns were made of finer wool, or even imported silks, dyed with costly pigments. Deep blues, rich reds, and golden yellows marked wealth and status. Their sleeves were long and trailing, their embroidery intricate. Yet these clothes, heavy with fabric and ornament, could be cumbersome. Moving through castle corridors in a trailing gown, or balancing a tall headdress, was no easier than managing chores in a peasant's kirtle. Both noble and peasant women lived with the daily negotiations of cloth against skin, of beauty against practicality. Undergarments were minimal. The linen shift served as the main layer, and sometimes the only one. Stockings were tied with garters if a woman had them, but many did without. Corsets, as we think of them today, belonged to later centuries. Instead, women bound themselves with belts or girdles, which could also hold small pouches or tools. A key, a knife, or even a small charm might hang from a woman's belt, making it as much a symbol of her household authority as a practical accessory. Jewelry for peasants was rare, perhaps a simple brooch or bead passed down in a family. For noble women, rings, necklaces, and decorated girdles served as markers of wealth, gifts from husbands or fathers, and symbols of family prestige. Still, even the finest jewels could not soften the reality of drafty halls, icy chambers, or damp fields. Clothing, no matter how rich, was always at war with the elements. Comfort, as we know it, was scarce. Wool itched, leather cracked, linen wore thin. Winters meant piling on every garment available, while summers meant sweating beneath layers designed more for modesty than for relief. Children's clothing was simply smaller versions of adult garments, leaving little room for playful freedom. Yet clothing was also deeply symbolic. The colour of a gown, the way a veil was pinned, or the quality of fabric, told neighbours much about a woman's status, her marital state, and her household's wealth. To be poorly clothed was not just uncomfortable, it was visible proof of poverty. Women carried that weight on their shoulders as surely as they carried firewood or baskets of grain. Still, within these limits, women found ways to make clothing personal. A peasant might stitch a pattern into her apron, or carefully mend a garment so that it lasted another year. A noblewoman might spend long hours embroidering a border with flowers, saints, or heraldic designs. Clothes were not just functional, they were expressions of care, patience, and sometimes quiet pride. So when we imagine the medieval woman wrapped in her wool and linen, we must remember every garment was both a shield against hardship and a record of her life. Stains, patches, and embroidery alike spoke of her daily work, her family's fortunes, and her own persistence. From the weight of wool, we turn now to another heavy expectation placed upon women: courtship and marriage, the binding ties that shaped not just individual lives, but entire families and communities. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely a matter of romance. For most women, it was a practical arrangement, sometimes tender, sometimes harsh, but almost always shaped by family interests rather than personal choice. To understand medieval womanhood, we must look at the web of expectations that surrounded courtship and the binding of lives together. For peasant women, marriage was local. Villages were small, and most people married within walking distance of home. Courtship might begin with shared labor, working side by side in fields, tending animals together, or meeting at communal gatherings like harvest festivals. Songs, dances, and games provided rare moments for young men and women to notice one another. Even so, family approval was crucial. A daughter could not simply marry whom she pleased. Parents weighed a suitor's land, tools, reputation, and ability to provide. A poor match could weaken the whole household's survival. Noble marriages were far more strategic. For them, marriage was about property, power, and alliances. A daughter's hand could secure peace between rival families, bring new lands into a lineage, or cement loyalty between lords. Young noblewomen were often betrothed as children, their futures decided years before they were old enough to understand. Some were even sent to live with their future husband's family during childhood, raised as both guest and future bride. The role of dowries shaped much of this process. A dowry was the wealth a bride brought into marriage, sometimes coin, sometimes land, sometimes linens, or household goods. For peasant families, scraping together a modest dowry might mean years of savings or the sale of livestock. For noble families, dowries could be vast, involving estates, castles, or political favors. In both cases, daughters were seen not only as beloved children, but as vital threads in the fabric of family fortune. Marriage customs varied across regions, but certain rituals were common. A betrothal, often made public before witnesses, bound two families together. Breaking a betrothal could be as scandalous as breaking a marriage. Consent mattered in theory, especially after the Church established its authority over marriage in the 12th century. But in practice, a young woman's consent was often guided or pressured by her parents. On the day of a wedding, celebrations filled the air. Even the poorest families tried to provide a feast, if only bread, ale, and a little meat. Villagers gathered, musicians played, and couples danced. In noble households, weddings could stretch into days of revelry, filled with banquets, tournaments, and displays of wealth. Yet beneath the joy lay serious undertones. Marriage was a contract, binding not only two people but two families, two lineages, two sets of fortunes. For women, marriage meant transition. A bride left her family home and joined her husband's household, taking on new duties and loyalties. In many cases, she had little say in the shape of her daily life after this moment. For peasants, she might join her husband in the fields, managing crops and animals together. For nobles, she stepped into the role of lady of the manor, expected to manage servants, oversee estates, and ensure the continuation of her husband's line. The Church viewed marriage as both sacred and practical. Priests blessed unions, but they also enforced rules. Prohibitions against marrying too close a relative, against marrying during certain holy seasons, and against unions without proper consent. Sermons reminded women of their duties: to obey husbands, to bear children, to keep households in order. These expectations weighed heavily, but they also gave women a defined place in society, one that could not easily be dismissed. Still, within these arrangements, affection could bloom. Many couples, though married for duty, grew into companionship, letters and poems reveal tenderness between husbands and wives, even if such emotions were rarely the starting point. Some marriages, of course, were harsh, filled with imbalance and difficulty, but others became true partnerships, sustained by shared labor and mutual reliance. For unmarried women, life was more precarious. A peasant woman without a husband might struggle to support herself unless she had family or work in service. A noblewoman without marriage might be placed in a convent, her dowry funding a religious life instead of a household. In both cases, society made little room for women outside the framework of marriage or religion. Courtship and marriage, then, were less about romance and more about survival, duty, and family strategy. Women entered into them with varying degrees of choice, but once within, their roles were set: wife, mother, manager, and often silent partner in the web of medieval life. As we continue, we'll follow women into that next stage, married life itself. Beyond the ceremony and feast came the daily reality of partnership, households to run and expectations to fulfill. A medieval wedding was more than a union of two people. It was a spectacle of community, faith, and family duty. For peasants and nobles alike, it marked the moment when a woman's life shifted from daughter to wife, from one household to another. But what happened beyond the feast? What did married life look like for women once the celebrations ended and the daily rhythm of responsibility began? The wedding day itself was often joyful, if exhausting. In a village, neighbors crowded together, bringing what food or drink they could spare. A bride might wear her best dress, sometimes borrowed or freshly mended, and a garland of flowers in her hair. Her dowry linens, a chest, perhaps a goat or cow, was paraded or quietly carried into her new home. After the church blessing, the couple walked through the village, followed by music, laughter, and toasts of ale. That night, the community might gather around a fire, singing and dancing late into the night. For noble families, weddings were more elaborate affairs. Gowns of velvet and silk shimmered in candlelight. Guests feasted on roasted meats and spiced wine, and minstrels played as dancers filled the hall. The joining of two houses was not just a celebration, but a statement of power, one witnessed by allies and rivals alike. Sometimes, noble weddings stretched on for days, each meal and festivity another reminder of wealth and influence. Yet, whether in cottage or castle, once the feast was done, the true test began, adjusting to new life as a wife. For peasant women, this often meant leaving their childhood home and moving into their husband's dwelling, sometimes with his parents, siblings, or even grandparents under the same roof. Privacy was rare. A young bride might share her new home not only with her husband but with livestock, smoke, and the chatter of a crowded household. She was expected to adapt quickly, taking up her share of work, tending fields, brewing ale, spinning cloth, and feeding the family. If her husband's family had land or tools, she was now part of the labor that kept them productive. Noble brides faced different, though no less demanding, expectations. A lady of a manor had to manage a household staff, oversee the kitchens and storerooms, and sometimes act in her husband's stead when he was away at war or court. Her skills in organization, hospitality, and diplomacy were as vital as her ability to bear children. She was the visible face of her husband's household, responsible for its order and reputation. One of the most immediate and heavy expectations placed on new wives was fertility. The church taught that marriage was for procreation, and families relied on children for labor, inheritance, and legacy. A young wife was expected to conceive soon after marriage. Failure to do so could bring whispers, blame, or pressure, sometimes directed at her, sometimes at both partners. Midwives, herbs, and prayers were part of the hidden rituals of early marriage, as couples hoped for healthy children to secure their futures. The adjustment was not without its tender moments. Many couples, though brought together by duty, found comfort in companionship. Shared work in fields or shared laughter at a feast could knit bonds stronger than the contracts that bound them. A wife might rise early to prepare bread, while her husband worked beside her in the fields. In the evenings, they might sit together by the fire, children sleeping nearby, telling stories or simply enjoying the warmth of presence. Still, early marriage was a time of learning and testing. A young woman had to balance the expectations of her new family with her own habits and upbringing. She had to earn respect within her husband's household, proving her diligence, thrift, and care. Conflicts with in-laws, especially mothers-in-law, were not uncommon, as authority in the household shifted with new arrivals. For women of all classes, marriage also changed their legal identity. In many regions, a married woman was considered under the authority of her husband, her property and earnings merging into his. Yet in practice, wives often managed household finances, made purchases in markets, and even defended family interests in court when husbands were absent. Their voices, though restricted by law, carried weight in daily life. The early days of marriage set the tone for years to come. Some women found themselves in harsh unions, with little kindness or choice. Others grew into genuine partnerships, sustained by mutual reliance. But in every case, marriage marked a turning point, the beginning of adult womanhood, with all its burdens and possibilities. From here, our journey must turn to one of the most defining aspects of women's married lives: fertility, motherhood, and the fragile, often perilous path of bringing new life into the medieval world. For a medieval woman, fertility was not just a private matter, it was central to her identity, her family's survival, and even her community's stability. A wife was expected to bring children into the world, often many of them, and this expectation shaped her life from the moment she married. In peasant households, children were extra hands for labor. A daughter could help with spinning and tending animals, while sons worked in the fields. Each birth brought the promise of more support for the household, though it also meant another mouth to feed. For noble families, children were heirs, alliances, and political tools. A daughter could be married into another house. A son could inherit land or title. Fertility carried both joy and pressure, and the weight of that expectation rested most heavily on the mother. Pregnancy itself was a time of uncertainty. There were no doctors as we think of them today, and medical knowledge was a blend of herbal remedies, folk wisdom, and prayers. A woman might drink infusions of raspberry leaves or chamomile to strengthen her body. Charms were whispered over her, saints invoked for safe delivery. Midwives, experienced women in the community, guided expectant mothers with both practical skill and ritual protections. They knew which herbs could ease pain, which positions could help labor, and which prayers might calm fear. Still, danger was constant. Childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. Complications like obstructed labor, infection, or hemorrhage were often fatal without modern knowledge or tools. Families understood this risk intimately, and communities often surrounded expectant mothers with support. Women gathered to assist in birth, and neighbors offered food or help in the days following. The church also played a role. Baptism was urgent, and if a newborn seemed weak, a midwife might baptize the child immediately, believing its soul depended on it. In stronger cases, the priest would perform the rite within days, sometimes at the church, sometimes at home. This urgency reveals how fragile new life was, and how deeply faith was tied to survival. Motherhood brought immense work alongside joy. Infants were swaddled, nursed, and rocked in wooden cradles. Mothers nursed their children when possible, though in noble households, wet nurses were often employed. Feeding was constant, as was soothing crying, watching for illness, and keeping little ones safe in homes filled with open fires, sharp tools, and animals underfoot. Yet despite the dangers, children were cherished. Mothers sang lullabies, some passed down for generations. They crafted small toys from scraps of cloth or carved wood. A flower crown, a simple rattle, or a ball of cloth could bring delight. Even in households where food was scarce, affection was abundant, woven into the rhythm of daily care. The spacing of children was close. With little knowledge of effective contraception, many women bore a child nearly every 2 years. Some survived to adulthood, others did not. Infant mortality was high, with fevers, infections, and poor harvests claiming many young lives. For mothers, each loss was a deep wound, though often spoken of quietly, folded into the resilience of daily life. Communities shared these griefs, with neighbors offering comfort, and the church reminding families of heaven's promise. For noble women, fertility was as much a duty as a hope. A lady's worth was often measured by her ability to produce heirs. A queen who bore no son could find her marriage questioned, her influence diminished. Yet some noble women used motherhood as a source of power, shaping alliances through their children's marriages and gaining respect as matriarchs. Motherhood did not end at birth. Women guided their children through their earliest lessons, teaching prayers, showing how to work, and passing down household skills. Boys often left for apprenticeships or training in their early teens, but girls remained close, learning directly from their mothers. In this way, women transmitted not only practical knowledge but culture itself. Songs, stories, remedies, and traditions that endured across centuries. Motherhood was both burden and blessing. It carried risk, pain, and sorrow, but also deep joy, pride, and continuity. To cradle a newborn in a smoky cottage, or to watch children tumble in play across a castle courtyard, was to see hope for the future in a world filled with uncertainty. And as children grew, the work of raising them shaped women's lives, further balancing nurture with discipline, teaching resilience in a world where survival was never guaranteed. That is where we turn next. The everyday reality of child rearing and the quiet strength it demanded. Raising children in the Middle Ages was both a joy and a trial. For women, motherhood did not end with childbirth. It continued in the long, daily work of keeping children alive, teaching them skills, and preparing them for a future that was often uncertain. In a peasant household, children were never idle. As soon as they could walk, they were folded into the rhythm of family labor. A girl of 4 might carry a small bundle of sticks for the hearth. A boy scarcely older might herd geese or fetch water from the well. Games and play certainly existed. Children rolled hoops, played with dolls, or sang songs, but these moments were woven into a life where work was constant and survival was shared. Mothers were the first teachers. They showed daughters how to spin wool, mend clothing, and prepare food. Sons, too, learned from their mothers in early years how to tend fires, care for animals, or mind younger siblings. Fathers would later take on more of the teaching for boys. But in those early formative years, a mother's hand guided everything. In noble households, the process looked somewhat different. Noble children were sometimes raised by wet nurses or nursemaids, with mothers overseeing from a distance. Yet noble women remained responsible for ensuring their children were properly educated, whether in letters, manners, or faith. Boys might be sent to other households to serve as pages or squires, while daughters learned household management, embroidery, and music under their mother's or governess's watch. Still, the essential truth remained. Mothers bore the emotional weight of raising children, regardless of class. Illness was a constant shadow over medieval childhood. Fevers, coughs, rashes. What we might consider minor today could quickly turn deadly without modern medicine. Mothers knew herbs and remedies, but they also knew the limits of their power. Midwives and wise women were called upon to help, but prayers to saints and the Virgin Mary often formed the strongest comfort. Mothers lit candles, whispered charms, and clutched rosaries, hoping to shield their little ones from fate. Childhood mortality was high. It was common for families to lose one, two, or even several children before adulthood. This loss shaped women profoundly. They grieved deeply, though often quietly, as survival demanded they continue caring for those who remained. Some expressed sorrow through lullabies or prayers, weaving their grief into traditions passed on to the next generation. The resilience of medieval mothers lay not in avoiding heartbreak, but in enduring it, holding on to hope even in the face of repeated loss. Yet amid hardship, there was joy. The laughter of children playing in the fields, the chatter of siblings by the hearth, the sight of little ones learning their first prayers all gave mothers strength. Many medieval songs and folk tales reveal a tender affection for children, proof that despite the harshness of life, love was abundant. Mothers carved small wooden toys, taught riddles, and passed on stories that entertained as much as they instructed. Discipline, too, was part of child rearing. Children were expected to obey and contribute, and mothers often carried the role of enforcer. A sharp word, a firm hand, or the withholding of treats reminded children of their duties. Yet discipline was balanced with nurture, for families could not afford broken bonds when survival depended on unity. As children grew into adolescence, a mother's influence shifted but did not vanish. Daughters remained under their mother's guidance until marriage, learning the full scope of household management. Sons, though often apprenticed or trained elsewhere, still carried with them the values and lessons instilled by their mothers. In this way, women shaped the future far beyond their own lifetimes. Their patience, their teachings, and their endurance echoed in the generations that followed. Even when their names were not recorded in history, their influence was carried forward in every child who survived, every tradition that endured, every song that was sung anew. Child rearing, then, was both fragile and enduring. It was marked by loss, but also by resilience, and it reminds us that medieval women, though often hidden in history, held the beating heart of their families and communities. From the quiet struggles of motherhood, we turn next to another layer of women's lives, their place within noble households, where duties of management and influence carried their own challenges and expectations. When we picture castles, we often imagine armored knights, roaring fires, and grand banquets in echoing halls. But within those stone walls lived women whose lives were as demanding as any peasants, though their challenges were different. Noble women were not idle ladies of leisure. They were managers, diplomats, and caretakers of entire estates. Their hidden labour held castles together just as surely as peasants' toil sustained the countryside. A noblewoman's responsibilities began with the household itself. Castles were not cosy homes but sprawling, drafty fortresses that required constant oversight. Storerooms had to be stocked with grain, salted meat, and barrels of ale to feed both family and servants through long winters. Kitchens had to run smoothly, with bread baked daily, meals prepared for dozens, sometimes hundreds of people, and provisions managed with care. As mistress of the household, a noblewoman directed this work, ensuring that nothing was wasted and that her family's wealth was displayed in proper hospitality. Hospitality was not just courtesy, it was politics. Guests, whether neighbours, allies, or rival lords, judged a household by its table. A poorly managed feast could harm a family's reputation, while generosity could strengthen alliances. A noblewoman's role as hostess, ensuring that meals were abundant and guests well treated, was a quiet but powerful form of diplomacy. When her husband was away, whether at war, at court, or on pilgrimage, a noblewoman often became the de facto ruler of the estate. She managed accounts, oversaw tenants, and made legal decisions. Records survive of women collecting rents, hiring workers, and even defending castles during sieges. Though the law might describe women as dependent, in practice, many ran vast estates with competence and authority. The rhythm of a noblewoman's day varied with the seasons and her household size. In the morning, she might supervise kitchens, check storerooms, or meet with stewards. She might also sit with women of her household, spinning, weaving, or embroidering. These tasks were not only practical but symbolic, producing fine cloth for the family and demonstrating her diligence and virtue. Later in the day, she might attend mass, receive guests, or review accounts. Evenings could bring music, storytelling, or quieter moments with family by the hearth. Religious devotion formed a significant part of noble women's lives. Many maintained private chapels, employing priests to say mass for their households. They sponsored churches, endowed convents, and gave alms to the poor, acts that displayed piety and reinforced their family's influence. For some, like Eleanor of Aquitaine or Blanche of Castile, faith and politics intertwined, shaping not just households but kingdoms. Despite wealth, comfort was limited. Castles were cold, their stone walls swallowing heat even from roaring fires. Noble women wore layers of wool and fur, and their chambers were hung with tapestries to block drafts. Even so, winters were harsh. Letters and chronicles mention noble women falling ill in damp halls or suffering from the same chills and fevers that plagued peasants in their huts. Noble women also bore the constant pressure of fertility. Producing heirs was essential, not only for family continuity, but for political stability. Queens and ladies alike were judged by their ability to bear children, especially sons. Success brought honor and security. Failure could mean disgrace, annulment, or political upheaval. This burden weighed heavily, even for the most powerful women. Yet within these constraints, noble women found influence. They advised husbands, guided sons, and arranged daughters' marriages. Their patronage of artists, writers, and clerics shaped culture itself. Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 15th century, praised women who used their positions wisely, demonstrating that even in a male-dominated society, noble women wielded quiet but enduring power. Life in a castle, then, was not one of idle luxury. It was a balance of duty, management, devotion, and survival different from the toil of peasants, yet demanding in its own way. Noble women carried the weight of households, estates, and often political alliances, their work hidden beneath the glamour of stone walls and silken gowns. From the halls of castles, let us return to the humbler world of the village, where peasant women, though far from power and wealth, displayed a different kind of strength, the ingenuity of survival in seasons of hardship. If noble women carried the weight of castles and estates, peasant women carried the weight of survival itself. Their ingenuity in the face of scarcity, cold, and hardship kept families alive through the harshest conditions of medieval life. Every season demanded new strategies, and every year brought challenges that tested their resilience. In spring, when fields were ploughed and seeds scattered, women worked beside men, often barefoot in the mud. Their hands spread seed, their backs bent low to weed rows of crops, and their voices sang work songs to keep rhythm. Children toddled nearby, or were carried on hips as women balanced motherhood with labor. When livestock birthed their young, women tended both mother and offspring, coaxing milk from goats and cows to nourish their families. Summer brought longer days but little rest. Women gathered herbs from meadows and hedgerows, plantain for wounds, yarrow for fevers, sage for cleansing. These herbs filled baskets, dried in the sun, and were stored for later use, forming the household's medicine chest. They also tended vegetable gardens, where beans, onions, and leeks grew between small patches of flowers, a mixture of beauty and necessity. The autumn harvest was the busiest time of all. Entire communities turned out to reap fields of grain. Women cut and bundled stalks, beat grain from husks, and carried baskets heavy with apples, nuts, and root vegetables. Every store mattered. A poorly gathered harvest could mean hunger by midwinter. So women worked tirelessly, their hands blistered, their bodies sore, knowing that each sack of grain was another step away from famine. Winter, though, was the true test of ingenuity. When fields lay frozen and days were short, survival depended on what women had preserved. Root vegetables were stored in pits lined with straw. Cabbages were hung from rafters. Dried beans and peas filled sacks. Women brewed weak ale, baked coarse bread, and stretched soups with whatever scraps remained. If food grew scarce, they bartered with neighbours, foraged in woods, or thinned meals to keep families fed. Homes themselves were fragile barriers against the cold. Drafts swept through wattle and daub walls, and dirt floors turned to mud with winter damp. Women stuffed cracks with moss, spread rushes and straw to insulate floors, and patched thatch roofs as best they could. Livestock were often brought indoors, their body heat adding a little warmth, though at the cost of smells and noise. Clothing, too, required ingenuity. Woolen garments were layered, patched, and passed down through generations. A woman might unravel an old cloak to respin its threads, or cut worn tunics into children's garments. Mittens were rare. Instead, cloaks were pulled tight, and hands warmed near fires whenever possible. Women also made use of every scrap of fur or hide, fashioning rough shoes or linings for garments. Ingenuity extended beyond survival to small comforts. Women scented rushes on floors with herbs like rosemary and lavender, bringing a whiff of freshness to smoky rooms. They embroidered aprons or added bright threads to dull garments, creating beauty amid poverty. They told stories around the hearth, their voices weaving warmth into cold nights. Communal resilience was another form of ingenuity. Women leaned on one another, sharing food when they could, tending each other's children, or lending tools and labour. At harvest, they worked side by side. At childbirth, they gathered around the expectant mother. In grief, they shared mourning. Their networks of support were as essential as the food they grew. Though history often reduces peasants to faceless labourers, women's ingenuity shaped every corner of village life. They were the ones who stretched meals, patched roofs, preserved herbs, and soothed children through hunger. Their quiet creativity kept entire communities from collapse. And while peasant women battled hardship in cottages and fields, other women pursued lives behind cloister walls. The convent offered an alternative path, one where faith, learning, and devotion created a world apart from marriage and motherhood. That is where our story will turn next. For some medieval women, the path of life did not lead to marriage, fields, or castles, but to the cloister. Religion offered both refuge and responsibility, shaping lives within convent walls and giving women a role in spiritual and intellectual traditions that reached across centuries. Entering a convent could happen for many reasons. Some girls were given to religious houses by their families, especially if dowries for marriage were too costly. Others sought the life voluntarily, drawn by devotion or by the promise of learning and stability. For noble families, placing a daughter in a convent could serve both piety and practicality, ensuring her care while avoiding the expense of a marriage alliance. Inside the convent, daily life was ruled by the rhythm of bells. The day began before dawn with matins, the first of many prayers that marked the hours. Women rose from their straw pallets, gathered in the chapel, and chanted psalms in voices that echoed through stone halls. The hours of the day unfolded in prayer, work, study, and silence. Nuns lived by rules that emphasized humility and obedience, yet within these walls they found opportunities rare for women outside. Convents were centers of learning. Women studied Latin, copied manuscripts, and sometimes composed music or poetry. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, wrote visionary works of theology, composed hymns still sung today, and even advised emperors and popes. Christine de Pizan, though not a nun herself, was educated in a courtly environment that drew heavily from traditions of convent learning. But not every nun was a writer or visionary. Most lived quieter lives, tending gardens, making medicines, or embroidering vestments for churches. They cared for the sick, offered hospitality to travelers, and educated girls from noble families. In this way, convents served as places of healing, learning, and refuge, run by women whose authority within their walls was recognized and respected. Abbesses, the leaders of convents, wielded particular influence. Some controlled lands, collected rents, and made decisions much like lords of estates. They managed finances, directed building projects, and negotiated with local rulers. In an age when women's voices were often silenced in public, abbesses spoke with authority both spiritual and practical. For women who longed for a life apart from the duties of wife and mother, the convent could be a sanctuary. It offered community, purpose, and a measure of independence. Yet, it also demanded sacrifice. Nuns vowed chastity, obedience, and poverty. They gave up the possibility of children and family life, dedicating themselves entirely to God and their sisters in faith. Beyond convent walls, religion also shaped women's daily lives at home. Mothers taught children their prayers, kept household shrines with small crucifixes or candles, and marked the calendar with saints' days and feasts. Pilgrimages, though arduous, were sometimes undertaken by women journeys to shrines like Canterbury, Santiago de Compostela, or Rome, made with hope for healing, blessing, or spiritual renewal. Faith infused every corner of women's lives. Women turned to saints as intercessors, especially female figures like the Virgin Mary, Street Margaret, or Street Catherine. Mary, in particular, stood as the model of womanhood, pure, devoted, and maternal her image, gazing down from altarpieces and stained glass, reminding women of both ideals and comfort. Yet not all religious roles were sanctioned. Some women lived as recluses, anchoresses sealed into cells attached to churches, devoting their lives to prayer. Others became mystics, claiming visions or ecstatic experiences that drew both reverence and suspicion. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century Englishwoman, recorded her visions and pilgrimages in one of the earliest known autobiographies in English. A reminder that even outside convents, women could carve paths of devotion. Religion gave medieval women both boundaries and possibilities. It restricted them with ideals of obedience and chastity, yet also provided spaces where their voices could be heard, their skills valued, and their influence felt. Within convent walls, they sang, studied, healed, and led. At home, they taught faith to their children, wove prayers into daily labor, and found solace in the rhythms of devotion. As we move forward, we'll look more closely at one of the roles where religion and daily life overlapped most intimately: the role of women as healers, midwives, herbalists, and wise women whose knowledge of body and spirit was passed down through generations. In a world without modern medicine, medieval women became the first line of care for their families and communities. They were midwives, herbalists, and wise women. Their knowledge passed down not through books, but through practice, memory, and tradition. Healing was not just a task, it was a role of trust, responsibility, and sometimes quiet power. Every household depended on a woman's ability to tend the sick. A mother knew which herbs could soothe fevers, which poultices might ease a wound, which teas calmed a troubled stomach. A handful of sage, a sprig of rosemary, a root of valerian, these were her tools. Herbs were grown in gardens, gathered from meadows, or bought in markets, dried and stored for use through the year. Recipes for remedies travelled by word of mouth, carried in the memories of women who mixed them with prayer and instinct. Midwives held a special place in this world. They were trusted with life's most perilous threshold, childbirth. Called in at all hours, they guided mothers through labour, offering both practical skill and emotional comfort. They cut cords, swaddled infants, and whispered prayers for strength. If complications arose, They relied on experience, herbs, and sometimes desperate improvisation. To their communities, midwives were both essential and mysterious, their hands holding both hope and fear. Healing was never just physical. Women blended remedies with spiritual protection. A charm whispered over a poultice, a psalm recited while binding a wound, a candle lit before the Virgin Mary. These acts merged faith with medicine. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was fluid, and women moved within it with quiet confidence. Wise women, often older members of the community, carried vast stores of knowledge. They knew which plants grew in shadow, which roots were best harvested under the waning moon, which herbs to mix for pain or to ease childbirth. Their wisdom, though often unrecorded, was a vital thread of survival. Communities turned to them not only for healing, but for counsel, their reputations carrying weight across generations. Yet this role was not without risk. The same knowledge that made women healers also made them vulnerable to suspicion. If remedies failed, if illness spread, or if a child was lost, whispers could turn into accusations. Some wise women were respected, others feared, though the great witch hunts would come later. In the early modern period, medieval women already walked a fragile line between healer and scapegoat. For noble women, healing also had its place. Many ladies managed physic gardens within castle grounds, cultivating herbs for both kitchen and infirmary. Some learned the basics of surgery and medicine from clerical texts. Though such knowledge was rare, noble women oversaw care for their households, ensuring that servants, tenants, and family alike had remedies when illness struck. Their patronage also supported hospitals and almshouses, institutions that began to emerge in medieval towns as centers of charity and care. Healing was as much about comfort as cure. A cool cloth laid across a fevered brow, a lullaby sung to a restless child, a whispered reassurance. These acts mattered as much as herbs or potions. Women carried not only the knowledge of plants but the gentleness of presence, the ability to soothe fear and bring peace in the face of uncertainty. It is striking to realize that much of this knowledge was never written down. Male physicians, trained in universities, recorded theories based on Galen and Hippocrates, often remote from the realities of village life. Women's medicine, in contrast, was lived and practical. It may not have filled books, but it filled bellies, calmed fevers, and helped countless children into the world. Women as healers remind us of their central place in medieval survival. They carried the wisdom of fields and gardens, blended it with faith, and offered it freely to their communities. Their knowledge was fragile, easily lost, but for centuries it sustained families through sickness, childbirth, and hardship. From here, we turn to another sphere of women's labour, one that brought them out of their homes and into the bustling life of towns and marketplaces, where their work and voices shaped the pulse of medieval economies. Beyond the fields and hearths, medieval women played vital roles in the growing economies of towns and villages. The marketplace was a stage where their labour became visible, where survival blended with trade, and where women's voices rang out in bargaining, gossip, and song. Though records rarely praised them, women were the lifeblood of these bustling spaces. Picture a market square at dawn. Stalls are set up with rough wooden planks. Baskets are laid out, and the smell of fresh bread, herbs, and animals fills the air. Among the traders are women of every age, balancing baskets on their hips, arranging cheeses on cloths, or calling out prices for eggs, butter, and ale. Their goods are humble but essential, forming the daily bread of townspeople's lives. Ale brewing was one of the most common trades for women. Known as alewives, they brewed small batches of drink in their homes, selling it by the mug or jug. Ale was not a luxury. It was the safe drink of everyday life, safer than water in many towns. For some women, brewing became a steady source of income. though it carried risks of fines if measures or quality fell short. Their signs, often a broom or branch hung outside the door, announced their trade to passers-by. Other women sold textiles, spinning wool into yarn, weaving cloth, or sewing garments for sale. In towns with guilds, women sometimes entered trades more formally. Widows of craftsmen could inherit their husbands' businesses, running bakeries, workshops, or shops in their own right. In cities like Paris or London, records show women registered as members of guilds in brewing, baking, or silk work. These were rare opportunities, but they reveal that women's labor was recognized in urban economies. Markets were also social spaces. Women exchanged not only goods, but news: who was marrying, who was ill, whose crops had failed. These conversations wove communities together, carrying information across villages and towns. Children darted between stalls, learning the rhythms of trade from their mothers, their ears catching songs of vendors that advertised wares in rhymes and chants. For noble women, the marketplace was less about selling and more about managing. They oversaw estates that produced goods for market wool, grain, cheese, and ensured that tenants and servants delivered their dues. Some noble women also engaged in trade indirectly, investing in ventures or ensuring their dowries were tied to productive lands. Their presence at market was less visible, but their influence on the goods that reached it was profound. The church, too, had a presence in markets. Fairs held on saints' days drew large crowds, with women selling candles, rosaries, and devotional trinkets. Pilgrims often encountered women as vendors along the roads to shrines, providing food, lodging, or simple wares. These fairs combined faith and commerce, with women at the heart of both. Yet markets could also be places of vulnerability. Women risked harassment, theft, or fines for breaking local rules. Authorities sometimes tried to limit their roles, favoring male merchants and guild members. Still, necessity drove women to persist. Selling surplus eggs or weaving cloth into marketable goods could mean the difference between hunger and survival. Despite these challenges, markets offered women a rare form of independence. They handled money directly, set prices, and negotiated with strangers. A successful market day gave not only food on the table, but also a sense of agency in a world that often limited women's choices. The image of a woman standing at a market stall, her hands arranging bread or weighing cheese, is a powerful reminder of her place in medieval society. She was not silent or invisible here. She was active, essential, and publicly recognized, even if records seldom preserved her name. From the bustle of markets, we turn now to another domain where women's presence was felt, though often in quieter ways. The realm of law and custom, where their rights and responsibilities shaped both households and communities. Medieval law was a tangled web of custom, church authority, and feudal obligation. For women, navigating this system was often difficult, yet they were not entirely powerless. Their rights and responsibilities varied depending on where they lived, their class, and their marital status. The law shaped their lives profoundly, but women also learned how to work within it, sometimes bending its limits in quiet acts of resilience. At the most basic level, a woman's legal identity was tied to her family. A daughter belonged to her father's household. A wife was considered under her husband's authority. This principle of coverture, the merging of a wife's legal identity into her husband's, meant that married women often could not make contracts, hold property, or sue in court independently. Yet in practice, there were exceptions. Widows, unmarried women, and even some married women acting with permission could and did appear in legal records. Inheritance was one of the key points where law and gender intersected. In many regions, sons inherited first, especially land. Daughters received dowries instead, their share of family wealth carried into marriage. But if no son survived, daughters could inherit estates, bringing land into their husbands' families. Noble women in particular could become heiresses, their marriages shaping the map of territories and alliances. While this gave them little personal freedom, it placed them at the center of political strategies. Widows often enjoyed more legal freedom than wives. Once a husband died, a widow could manage property, continue businesses, and even act as the head of household in court. Records from English towns show widows running taverns, lending money, and appearing in market courts. In rural communities, widows sometimes leased land, hired laborers, and provided for children with surprising independence. Their status as both vulnerable and respected figures gave them a unique place in medieval society. In towns, women also appeared in guild records and civic courts. Some sold goods, lent money, or stood as witnesses in disputes. Though guilds often restricted membership to men, widows could inherit workshops and carry on trades. In these moments, women stepped into the legal framework as recognized economic actors. Even if their authority was fragile, the church added another layer. Ecclesiastical courts oversaw matters of marriage, morality, and inheritance disputes involving wills. Women frequently appeared in these courts petitioning for annulments, disputing dowries, or defending their reputations against slander. Here, too, the balance was uneven. A woman accused of infidelity or misconduct could face harsh penalties, while men often faced lighter consequences. Still, women used church courts to assert rights, proving their place in the legal landscape. Custom also mattered. In some regions, local laws gave women greater or lesser rights. In certain parts of France and Germany, women could inherit more equally, alongside brothers. In others, women's property rights were strictly limited. What united these variations was the necessity for women to adapt, to understand the expectations of their community, and to find ways to secure their families within the structures that surrounded them. Legal documents remind us that medieval women were not entirely silent. Charters record their names, sometimes as witnesses, sometimes as benefactors, sometimes as plaintiffs or defendants. Each appearance, however small, is evidence of a woman navigating a world that sought to limit her but could not erase her. The law, then, was both constraint and opportunity. It restricted women's independence, binding them to fathers and husbands, yet it also gave spaces through widowhood, inheritance, and local custom where women could act with authority. In these spaces, women's quiet strength revealed itself, shaping not only households but the legal and economic fabric of medieval life. From here, our journey moves to a moment when women often found their greatest independence, widowhood. It was a time of loss, but also a window into lives lived with newfound authority and self-determination. In medieval society, a woman's life was often framed by her relationships, first as a daughter, then as a wife, and finally, if she lived long enough, as a widow. This last stage, though marked by loss, sometimes brought with it an independence that few women experienced at any other point in their lives. Widowhood was both burden and opportunity, a moment when the weight of survival pressed heavily, but so did the chance to step into roles normally reserved for men. The experience of widowhood varied dramatically depending on class. For a peasant woman, the death of her husband was both devastating and perilous. Men were the legal heads of households, and their loss could throw families into uncertainty. Yet it was often the widow who kept the household alive, managing land, animals, and children on her own. Many villages allowed widows to lease small plots of land in their husband's name, or continue working the same strips in communal fields. Though she might face hardship, her determination often ensured her children's survival. Some widows remarried quickly, especially if they were young. A second marriage could provide financial stability and additional protection for children, but others chose to remain single, preferring the autonomy widowhood provided. For the first time, they could make decisions about their labor, their property, and their households without a man's direct authority. This independence, though fragile, was significant. In towns, widowhood could open doors to economic opportunity. A widow of a craftsman might inherit his workshop, tools, and guild membership. Records show women running bakeries, breweries, and textile businesses, some for decades. These widows employed apprentices, made contracts, and appeared in court to defend their interests. Though guilds sometimes tried to limit their power, the practical reality was that communities needed their skills. A widow brewing ale or weaving cloth was not a curiosity, she was part of the economic backbone of her town. For noble women, widowhood carried a different weight. A noble widow often controlled lands and estates left in her husband's name, at least until sons came of age. She might act as guardian for her children, negotiating marriages, managing finances, and defending family holdings. Some noble widows wielded considerable power, their signatures appearing on charters, their voices influencing local politics. Unlike married noblewomen, who were legally overshadowed by husbands, widows often acted with authority, recognized by both tenants and rulers. The church, too, had its view of widowhood. It praised widows who remained chaste, seeing them as models of piety. Many widows entered convents, bringing their dowries to religious communities. Others lived semi-religious lives at home, dedicating themselves to prayer while continuing to manage households. Spiritual writers sometimes described widows as brides of Christ, freed from worldly ties and closer to God. Yet in practice, many widows balanced faith with the pressing needs of daily survival. Widowhood also reshaped social identity. In villages, widows were both respected and vulnerable. They were often sought out for advice, their years of experience making them natural figures of authority. Yet they could also be targets for gossip or suspicion, particularly if they lived alone or prospered in ways that seemed unusual. A widow who brewed strong ale, healed with herbs, or managed property too confidently could draw uneasy glances from neighbors. Emotionally, widowhood was complex. The loss of a husband meant grief, but also a shift in rhythm. A woman who had shared her days with another now bore the silence of absence. She might feel both sorrow and relief. Sorrow for companionship lost, relief for burdens lifted, if the marriage had been harsh or demanding. Medieval culture rarely recorded these inner feelings, but traces of them linger in wills, letters, and songs where widows expressed devotion or independence in their own words. Children often determined a widow's path. If she had young ones, her focus was on survival, keeping them fed, finding apprenticeships for sons, dowries for daughters, and ensuring the family's continuity. If her children were grown, she might choose a quieter life, perhaps joining a daughter in a convent or living with married kin. Some widows even travelled on pilgrimages, taking the opportunity to express devotion or seek healing after years of household labour. The image of the medieval widow, then, is not one of uniform sorrow or weakness. It is one of resilience, adaptation, and often surprising strength. She could be the quiet peasant woman, tending her garden alone after a long day in the fields. She could be the townswoman, standing at her husband's old market stall, now bargaining with confidence in her own name. She could be the noble lady, sealing documents with her seal, guiding her children's futures, and managing estates with authority that rivals her male counterparts. Widowhood was not an easy path, but it was one of the few moments when medieval women stepped into lives less bound by the direct control of men. In those years, however long or short, they tasted independence, and their choices left lasting marks on households, towns, and even entire regions. From widowhood, we turn now to a quieter realm, the ways women lived out their faith not in convents or courts, but within their homes, weaving devotion into daily life as seamlessly as they spun thread or baked bread. Faith was not only lived in convents, cathedrals, or pilgrimages. It was also woven into the daily rhythm of medieval households, most often through the hands and voices of women. For wives, mothers, and widows alike, devotion was not separate from work. It accompanied the stirring of the hearth, the weaving of cloth, the care of children, and the closing of shutters at night. Women carried religion into the intimate spaces of home, shaping both family practice and community belief. Morning often began with prayer. A woman might cross herself upon waking, whispering the Pater Noster or the Ave Maria before tending the fire. Many homes kept small shrines, a crucifix, an image of the Virgin Mary, or a relic obtained from a local pilgrimage. Candles, when affordable, were lit on feast days or during illness, their gentle flames marking sacred presence in otherwise humble cottages. For peasant women, faith was inseparable from work. As they spun wool, they recited prayers. As they baked bread, they marked loaves with the sign of the cross before placing them in ovens. The rhythms of the agricultural year were tied to the church calendar: planting at Easter, harvest blessings in autumn, fasting during Lent, feasting at Christmas and Pentecost. Women prepared special foods for saints' days, weaving spiritual meaning into the very act of cooking. Mothers were often the first teachers of faith. Children learned prayers at their mother's knees, repeating simple lines until they could recite them by heart. Women told Bible stories alongside folk tales, mixing the sacred with the familiar. They taught children reverence for holy days, the importance of almsgiving, and the duty to attend Mass. In this way, the transmission of Christian belief passed as much through mothers as through priests. Superstition mingled with devotion. Women tied charms against the evil eye, hung herbs in doorways, and whispered protective prayers over cradles. They invoked saints for help with childbirth, crops, or illness. Street Margaret for safe deliveries, Street Apollonia for toothaches, Street Roch for plague. These practices blended formal religion with local traditions, creating a tapestry of belief uniquely shaped within homes. For noble women, faith was expressed in both grandeur and intimacy. A lady might commission illuminated prayer books, richly decorated with gold and painted saints, to guide her devotions. She might also endow chapels or sponsor masses for her family's souls. Yet even in castles, faith entered daily life through the simplest gestures: kneeling before a crucifix, saying the rosary, or pausing to pray at a chapel window. Widows often deepened their religious devotion. Some took semi-religious vows, living at home but dedicating themselves to prayer and charity. Others became benefactors, giving alms or supporting convents. Their piety was not only personal, it reinforced family reputation, ensuring prayers for the dead and blessings for future generations. Communal faith also centered women's roles. In villages, women organized processions, decorated churches with flowers, and prepared candles for feast days. They joined in mystery plays, sung in parish choirs, and carried offerings to altars. Their presence gave life to community worship, even if their names went unrecorded in official chronicles. Faith in the home also offered comfort in hardship. When children fell ill, when harvests failed, when war loomed nearby, women turned to their prayers. They lit candles before saints, prayed novenas, and sought signs of hope. In their whispered words and steady hands, they carried both despair and resilience, keeping families anchored in faith, even when the world felt uncertain. It is easy to overlook the sacred in small gestures, but medieval women understood its power. A mother's blessing before a journey, a prayer spoken over bread, a candle lit in the night, all were acts of devotion, as meaningful as the grandest cathedral service. Through them, women shaped the spiritual lives of their families, sustaining belief not with books or sermons, but with daily practice lived faithfully in hearth and home. From these intimate devotions, we now turn to another realm of women's influence: food. For in kitchens and gardens, women not only fed their households, but also carried traditions, rituals, and the flavors that marked both feast and famine. Food was at the heart of medieval survival, and women were its keepers. From planting and harvesting to cooking and preserving, women's labor ensured that households were fed through seasons of both abundance and scarcity. What people ate and whether they ate at all was shaped by women's knowledge, resourcefulness, and unending work. In peasant households, daily meals were simple. The staple was pottage, a thick stew of grains, beans, and vegetables, simmered slowly in a pot over the hearth. Women added whatever the season allowed: cabbage in winter, leeks in spring, peas in summer, and turnips in autumn. Meat was rare, often reserved for feast days, but scraps of bacon or broth bones were added when available, lending precious flavor and strength. Bread accompanied nearly every meal, though its quality depended on status. Poor families ate coarse loaves of barley or rye, dense and dark, while wealthier ones could afford wheat. The kitchen, if it could be called that, was usually a smoky corner of a cottage, centered around the fire. Women managed not only the cooking, but the fire itself, keeping it alive from day to day. The skill of banking embers under ash each night was essential. Without it, the morning would mean the difficult task of sparking new flames. Pots of iron or clay hung from hooks, while wooden spoons and rough knives formed the basic tools of cookery. Preservation was a constant concern. Women salted fish and meat, dried beans and peas, smoked eels or herring, and stored apples in straw-lined baskets. Herbs and onions were hung from rafters, while root vegetables were buried in cool pits. Ale was brewed not only for drinking, but as a safer alternative to water, particularly in towns where wells could be fouled. Brewing was often women's work, and each household had its own recipe, its own taste passed from mother to daughter. Festive meals broke this rhythm of simplicity. On feast days, women prepared special dishes, meat pies, spiced cakes, or roasted birds. These occasions called for extra labor, stretching ingredients into abundance and marking time with flavors otherwise too rare. Women carried the responsibility of ensuring that the joy of feast days was felt in the stomach as well as the spirit. In noble households, food took on another dimension: display. Kitchens were vast operations, staffed by dozens, but the noblewoman still oversaw their order. She ensured that storerooms were stocked, spices accounted for, and servants managed. Banquets were political theatre as much as meals, and noblewomen's role in presenting them was vital. Tables groaned with roasted venison, peacocks with feathers reattached for show, and stews seasoned with costly imports like cinnamon and pepper. Though servants did the cooking, the ladies' approval and oversight marked the success of the feast. Yet even among the wealthy, preservation remained essential. Noble households needed to feed not only family, but also servants, retainers, and guests through the long months of winter. Noble women supervised the salting of barrels of fish, the storing of flour, and the careful accounting of wine and ale. Their skill in managing resources ensured both survival and reputation. Food was also spiritual. Women prepared meals in accordance with the church calendar, which mandated fasts on Fridays, during Lent, and on numerous vigils. Meat was replaced with fish, vegetables, and grains, requiring ingenuity to provide variety. Women adapted recipes, blending faith with sustenance. A loaf of bread marked with the cross before baking, a prayer whispered while stirring pottage. These small acts tied food to devotion. The bond between food and love was strong. Mothers fed children from their own bowls, saving the best scraps for the youngest. A wife might brew stronger ale for her husband after a day in the fields, or gather wild strawberries as a treat for her children. These gestures of care made food not only nourishment, but also comfort, weaving affection into daily survival. Scarcity, however, was always near. Poor harvests, floods, or harsh winters meant hunger. Women bore the brunt of this hardship, stretching meals thinner, eating less themselves so children had more, and finding creative ways to fill bellies with what little remained. Thin broth, acorn bread, or boiled weeds could mean the difference between surviving to spring or not. Their ingenuity in these times was an act of quiet heroism. Markets gave women another space to engage with food. They sold eggs, cheese, butter, and herbs, earning coins to buy what they could not produce. Their presence in markets tied household labor to wider economies, making women visible participants in trade. Every egg sold, every loaf bartered, was part of the fragile chain of survival. In both cottages and castles, women's work with food was unseen yet indispensable. They carried not only the burden of labor, but the responsibility of taste, comfort, and celebration. A well-prepared meal, no matter how simple, strengthened bonds within families and communities. So much of women's history is hidden, but the evidence of their work survives in recipes, in household records, and in the traditions of cooking still practiced today. Every loaf baked, every pot of pottage stirred, every herb gathered speaks of their resilience and care. From the daily act of feeding, our journey moves to the larger cycles of time itself, how women's lives were shaped by the turning of seasons, the passage of festivals, and the rhythms of the medieval year. The lives of medieval women were shaped as much by the turning of the seasons as by the walls of their homes. Time was not measured by clocks, but by the sun, the church bell, and the changing tasks that each season demanded. For women, these rhythms were relentless, but they also brought a sense of order to lives that might otherwise have felt uncertain. Spring marked renewal, both spiritual and practical. Fields had to be prepared, seeds sown, and gardens planted. Women worked alongside men, scattering seed and tending to young animals born after winter. They gathered early herbs, nettles, sorrel, and wild garlic that offered fresh greens after months of salted and dried food. Easter, falling in spring, was a season of fasting followed by celebration, and women prepared special breads or decorated eggs to mark the feast. With the lengthening of days came hope, but also the burden of endless labor to ensure survival later in the year. Summer stretched long and bright, but it left little room for rest. Women weeded gardens, harvested hay, and gathered herbs under the hot Sunday. Children helped, learning from their mothers how to recognize plants that healed or nourished. In some regions, women joined in sheep shearing, washing, and carding wool, setting the stage for spinning and weaving in the darker months. Summer also brought saints' days and fairs, times when women sold their produce, danced in the village square, and enjoyed rare moments of festivity. Yet behind the merriment lay constant vigilance. Storms, pests, or drought could undo months of work. Autumn was the season of harvest, the climax of the agricultural year. Entire villages worked side by side to gather grain, fruit, and nuts. Women tied sheaves of wheat, threshed grain, and stored apples in straw. They brewed fresh ale, churned butter, and prepared preserves for winter. It was exhausting labor, but also communal. Songs filled the fields, and neighbors helped one another, knowing survival depended on collective effort. After the harvest came Michaelmas, a feast of thanksgiving, and also a time when rents were due. Another reminder of the constant balance between joy and burden. Winter brought hardship and endurance. Days were short, homes were cold, and food supplies dwindled. Women stretched meals thin, rationing grain and relying on salted fish, dried beans, and root vegetables. Clothing was layered, patched, and wrapped tight against icy winds that slipped through cottage walls. Yet winter also brought moments of light Christmas feasts, candlelit processions at Candlemas, and the warmth of storytelling around the hearth. Women carried the responsibility of making these times festive, even with meager resources. The church calendar intertwined with these natural rhythms, guiding not only work, but also rest. Lent demanded fasting and simplicity. Easter brought feasting and joy. Advent was a time of preparation. Christmas a time of warmth. Saints' days dotted the year, offering moments of respite, fairs, or processions. Women prepared special foods, embroidered altar cloths, and joined in rituals that gave structure to their lives. Seasonal rhythms also governed women's bodies. Pregnancy and childbirth were often timed around the agricultural year. A child born in late spring or summer arrived when food was more plentiful. One born in deep winter faced greater risk. Women knew these patterns intimately, even if they did not express them in medical terms. Their bodies, like their work, moved with the seasons. For noble women, the cycle was different but no less demanding. Spring meant overseeing planting on estates, summer brought hunts and feasts, autumn required managing harvest dues, and winter demanded careful accounting of supplies for large households. Noble women also prepared for the religious festivals that punctuated each season, ensuring their households reflected both piety and prestige. Seasonality brought not only hardship but also joy. May Day celebrations filled villages with greenery and dance, often led by women weaving garlands and preparing feasts. Harvest festivals brought songs, laughter, and the satisfaction of full granaries. Even in winter, Christmas lit homes with candles, evergreen branches, and shared meals. These moments of festivity, often orchestrated by women, gave rhythm and meaning to lives otherwise defined by toil. Women's ingenuity was most visible in how they adapted to each season's demands. In spring, they coaxed seeds from soil. In summer, they gathered herbs for both food and medicine. In autumn, they preserved every possible scrap. In winter, they kept fires alive and spirits lifted. Their labor was the thread that stitched the seasons together, ensuring continuity through cycles of plenty and want. The medieval year was a tapestry of light and shadow, of feast and famine, of labor and devotion. And in every season, women's work carried families forward, their resilience woven into the fabric of time itself. From these natural rhythms, we now turn to moments of disruption, times when war and conflict shattered seasonal cycles, and women were called to new roles of endurance and responsibility. War was a constant shadow in the medieval world. Whether through raids, feuds between lords, or great campaigns waged by kings, conflict disrupted the fragile rhythms of daily life. Men marched to battle, but women bore the weight of what was left behind. Their lives in times of war reveal both hardship and hidden strength, as they stepped into roles that tested endurance and reshaped their place in society. When armies gathered, men of fighting age often left their homes, leaving women to manage households and fields alone. For peasant women, this meant planting, harvesting, and tending livestock without the extra labor of husbands, sons, or brothers. Tasks that had once been shared now fell entirely on their shoulders. They guided plows, carried heavy loads, and negotiated with neighbors for help, knowing that a failed crop could mean hunger. Survival demanded resilience, and women rose to the task. In towns, women kept workshops running when husbands went to war. They brewed ale, baked bread, and mended tools, ensuring communities did not collapse in the absence of men. Records show widows and wives managing accounts, paying taxes, and even appearing in courts on behalf of absent husbands. The legal system adapted reluctantly, but women's presence was undeniable. For noble women, war brought heavier responsibilities. Castles were not only homes but also fortresses, and when lords marched away, ladies often became their guardians. A noble woman might oversee defenses, manage supplies, and negotiate with allies or enemies. Chronicles tell of women organizing the repair of walls, rationing food during sieges, and rallying servants in moments of danger. Though rare, There were even instances of women taking up arms to defend their estates. Their courage remembered in legend, if not always in official records. War also touched women directly through displacement. Armies pillaged villages, burning crops, and seizing livestock. Women fled with children, carrying what little they could, seeking shelter in woods or nearby towns. Refugees depended on each other, forming fragile communities of survival amid uncertainty. Though their suffering was seldom chronicled in detail, their endurance was the silent backbone of survival during war. Women also followed armies as camp followers. They cooked, washed, mended clothing, and nursed the wounded. Some were wives or family members of soldiers, unable to remain behind. Others sought livelihood, selling food, drink, or services. Though their presence was often criticized by chroniclers, armies depended on them. Without women to provide these daily necessities, campaigns would have collapsed. Healing was another crucial role. Women tended the injured with herbs, poultices, and prayers, whether in camps, villages, or castles. They dressed wounds, soothed fevers, and offered comfort where doctors were scarce. Their knowledge, often dismissed in peacetime, became indispensable in war. Yet war also brought vulnerability. Women were exposed to violence, hunger, and exploitation. Armies brought not only destruction, but also fear. Chronicles often glossed over these hardships, focusing instead on the deeds of men. But in every burned village, every abandoned field, women's losses were real, and their survival was an act of courage. Despite hardship, women sometimes turned war into opportunity. Noble widows whose husbands fell in battle often assumed control of estates, acting as guardians for young heirs. Townswomen who kept businesses alive during conflict sometimes emerged with new respect and independence. Even peasant women, though rarely acknowledged, developed networks of mutual aid that strengthened communities long after armies moved on. Religion offered comfort during these times. Women lit candles for absent husbands and sons, prayed to saints for protection, and organized processions for peace. In moments of despair, their faith became both shield and anchor, helping families endure the chaos of conflict. The image of women in war is thus twofold. They were vulnerable to loss and violence, yet also vital in holding families, towns, and estates together. While men's deeds filled chronicles, women's endurance shaped survival. Their courage was not always dramatic, but was no less real the courage to keep fields sown, to feed children, to protect homes, and to rebuild after destruction. From the upheaval of war, we move now into quieter, but no less powerful territory. The world of women's secrets, their hidden knowledge of charms, remedies, and wisdom passed quietly from one generation to the next. Much of medieval women's power lay not in public acts, but in quiet knowledge, whispered from mother to daughter, shared among neighbors, and guarded in memory rather than books. These secrets were not necessarily sinister. They were the subtle arts of survival, healing, and influence, practiced in kitchens, gardens, and gatherings away from official eyes. In a world where written authority was dominated by men, women carried unwritten wisdom that shaped daily life. One realm of women's secrets was medicine. Herbs had to be gathered at the right time, plantain leaves picked before sunrise, yarrow cut during the waning moon. Women knew which plants soothed childbirth pains, which reduced fever, and which drove away worms or parasites. Recipes were rarely written down. Instead, they were passed orally, with small variations between villages. A healing brew for a cough might include honey, thyme, and fennel. Another, onion and sage boiled in ale. To outsiders, this was simple housekeeping. To women, it was a heritage of knowledge, honed through trial and tradition. Charms and rituals often accompanied these remedies. A poultice might be applied with a whispered prayer, a child's fever soothed with both herbs, and a sign of the cross. Amulets, pieces of iron, written scraps of psalms, or carved symbols were tied around necks for protection. These practices blurred the line between faith and folklore. To women, they were not contradictions but complements. Herbs healed the body. Prayers shielded the soul. Love was another domain of secrets. Women shared charms, said to attract affection or secure fidelity. A ribbon tied in a lover's clothing, a potion brewed with certain herbs, or a whispered blessing over bread. These were tokens of hope in a world where marriages were often arranged more for family than affection. Whether they worked or not mattered less than the comfort of agency they offered, a small way for women to influence lives often controlled by others. Secrets also surrounded childbirth. Midwives carried knowledge that was guarded carefully, both because of its value and because of the risks of failure. Techniques for easing labor, herbs to encourage contractions, and rituals for safe delivery were shared only with trusted apprentices. These secrets were not meant to deceive, but to protect. In a time when childbirth was dangerous, knowledge was precious, and women ensured it was preserved. Spiritual secrets were another layer. Mystics like Hildegard of Bingen or Marjorie Kempe recorded visions, but countless unnamed women also claimed dreams or insights that they shared privately. Some believed certain prayers or psalms had special power if said at midnight or while fasting. Others practiced forms of devotion not officially sanctioned but deeply meaningful, such as small household rituals or personal pilgrimages to local shrines. These quiet acts kept faith alive in intimate, personal ways. Not all secrets were benign. The same herbal knowledge that healed could, in the wrong mixture, cause harm. Plants like henbane or belladonna were known, at least dimly, for their dangerous effects. Rumors of women using such herbs spread unease, and though large-scale witch hunts belonged to later centuries, medieval women were sometimes accused of sorcery. A healer whose remedies failed, or a widow who prospered unusually, could be viewed with suspicion. Secrets gave women influence, but they also made them vulnerable. Yet most secrets were simply tools of resilience. Women guarded recipes for strong ale, techniques for preserving meat, or patterns for spinning finer yarn. They shared these quietly with daughters, ensuring continuity. In this way, women's knowledge formed a hidden curriculum of survival, unrecorded in chronicles, but essential to daily life. Even noble women held secrets. They might know which servants could be trusted, how to smooth over disputes among retainers, or how to write discreet letters in an age when communication was dangerous. Their secrets were not always herbs or charms, but strategies of management, of influence, of survival within the delicate politics of court. The secrecy itself mattered. In a society where women's voices were often dismissed, keeping knowledge within trusted circles preserved its power. It gave women spaces of authority quiet, unacknowledged, but real. A mother whispering to her daughter how to ease a fever. A group of women at a well exchanging remedies. A midwife teaching her apprentice the signs of a safe birth. All were moments where women's wisdom was sustained. The hidden life of women was not silent. It was spoken in whispers, woven into daily acts, and guarded against forgetting. Their secrets were not only of herbs or charms, but of resilience, kindness, and survival. From these whispered worlds, we turn next to a more visible but equally symbolic realm. The clothing women wore, garments that not only covered, but also revealed signaling identity, status, and belief in ways words never could. Clothing in the medieval world was far more than protection against cold or modesty before others. For women, what they wore expressed their identity, marked their place in society, and revealed subtle aspects of their lives that written records rarely preserved. Every garment, from the humblest woolen shift to the richest gown embroidered with gold thread, carried meaning. Clothing was status, religion, law, and self-expression, all stitched together in fabric. At its simplest, a medieval woman's wardrobe began with the chemise, a linen undergarment worn next to the skin. For peasant women, this might be the only piece washed regularly, as outer garments were often too heavy and difficult to launder. Over the chemise came a kirtle or gown, usually of wool, dyed in muted shades of brown, green, or blue if vegetable dyes were affordable, or left undyed in a natural grey or beige. An apron was tied at the waist for work, and a cloak was thrown over the shoulders in winter. For noble women, layers multiplied. A chemise was followed by a richly coloured gown, sometimes lined with fur. A surcoat, open at the sides to display the fabric beneath, could be decorated with embroidery, heraldic symbols, or edged in fine trim. Cloaks of velvet, fur, or silk draped around shoulders, fastened with ornate brooches. The richness of fabric, velvet, silk, brocade, was itself a statement, a visible reminder of wealth and status. Head coverings were almost universal. Married women, whether peasant or noble, were expected to cover their hair, a sign of modesty and virtue. A simple kerchief or wimple sufficed for peasants, while noble women arranged elaborate veils, sometimes starched into towering hennons, the pointed hats that have become iconic symbols of medieval fashion. These coverings were not just fashion but morality. Uncovered hair could signal impropriety, flirtation, or even sin. Clothing was so important as a marker of status that it was regulated by sumptuary laws. These laws, passed by kings and town councils, dictated what fabrics, colours, and furs people of different ranks could wear. A peasant could not dress in velvet. A merchant's wife could not wear ermine reserved for nobility. The intent was to preserve the visible hierarchy of society, ensuring that one's class was immediately recognizable by dress. For women, these laws were doubly binding, as they reflected both personal status and that of their husbands. A wealthy merchant's wife might dress finely, but within strict limits, signaling prosperity without overstepping into noble privilege. In this way, a woman's clothing became a public emblem of her family's place in society. Colours also carried meaning. Deep blues and reds, made with expensive dyes, marked wealth. Black, which required repeated dyeing to achieve richness, became fashionable among the elite in later centuries. Green often symbolized youth or fertility, while white was associated with purity and sometimes worn by brides. Clothing thus communicated without words, signaling age, wealth, virtue, and sometimes even mood or circumstance. For working women, practicality was essential. Long gowns were tucked up with belts when laboring in fields, keeping fabric out of the dirt. Aprons protected garments during cooking, brewing, or tending animals. In winter, women layered woolen garments, wrapping shawls or cloaks tightly against the cold. Shoes were simple leather turn shoes for peasants, replaced often as they wore out. For many, feet went bare in summer, toughened against soil and stone. Yet even among the poor, clothing was not devoid of pride. Women patched garments carefully, sometimes adding decorative stitching along seams. A bright ribbon or coloured belt might be worn on feast days, a small expression of joy amid poverty. In marketplaces, women were often described as tidy or neat in appearance, their clothing humble but well kept. Clothing also marked life's transitions. Brides often wore their best garments, sometimes with floral crowns or borrowed finery. Dowries sometimes included special garments or cloth, treasured pieces that linked families through marriage. In death, women were often buried in simple shifts or shrouds, but noble women might be interred in gowns that reflected their rank, sometimes with veils or wimples, symbolizing modesty, even in the grave. Religious life demanded its own clothing. Nuns wore habits, plain gowns of wool, often black or brown, with veils covering hair completely. The habits symbolized humility, and separation from worldly fashion. Yet even here, variations existed. Wealthy convents sometimes allowed finer fabrics, while poorer ones used rough homespun wool. For anchoresses or women in semi-religious lives, garments were chosen to signal withdrawal, often plain and unadorned. Festivals and holy days brought opportunities for special dress. Women wore brighter colours, garlands, or embroidered garments saved for rare occasions. Pilgrimages also left their mark. Women returned from shrines with badges pinned to cloaks or hats, tokens of devotion displayed in daily life. Clothing thus tied women to both faith and festivity, marking their place in communal rhythms. Clothing shaped not only identity, but also how women experienced their own bodies. Wool gowns were heavy, especially when wet. Layers of fabric restricted movement, though women grew accustomed to them. Shoes offered little support, and feet often ached after long days. Head coverings could be hot in summer, yet women wore them out of duty. Clothing was thus both shield and burden, protecting from cold and judgment, but also weighing heavily in physical labor. For noble women, the body was further shaped by fashion. Tight sleeves, long trailing hems, and elaborate veils limited movement, but emphasized grace. A noble woman's poise, enhanced by her clothing, became part of her identity, a performance of elegance expected of her rank. In contrast, peasant women valued garments that allowed them to bend, carry, and labor strength expressed through practicality rather than display. Clothing also communicated subtler messages. A widow's garments were often dark or plain, signaling mourning. A wealthy woman might signal generosity by wearing garments trimmed with fur, showing her family's prosperity. In courts, rivalry could be expressed through clothing who wore the richest fabrics, whose embroidery was most intricate. For ordinary women, a new gown might be a statement of prosperity after a good harvest, while patched garments revealed hardship. Clothing, then, was not silent. It spoke a language understood by all who looked. To see a woman in coarse brown wool was to know her as a peasant. To see her in velvet and silk was to recognize nobility. To glimpse a wimple was to know a woman's married status, while to see her hair uncovered could raise suspicion. Every fold of fabric, every stitch of thread, carried meaning in a society where visual signals mattered deeply. Women were not only wearers of clothing, they were its makers and preservers. Spinning, weaving, sewing, and mending were constant tasks. A mother's hands spun yarn for her children's garments, while daughters learned to patch tiers and embroider edges. Clothing was handed down, altered, and remade until fabric gave out completely. In this way, garments carried continuity, binding generations through shared labor. Even noble women, though not working with their own hands, oversaw the production of clothing. They managed stores of cloth, directed servants in sewing, and selected fabrics for their households. Their choices reflected not only fashion but also family identity, displaying heraldry and wealth through garments worn by retainers and kin alike. Clothing for medieval women was never mere covering. It was labor, law, symbol, and identity. It marked them as daughters, wives, mothers, or widows, as peasants, townsfolk, or nobles. It revealed wealth or poverty, piety or pride, joy or mourning. Through fabric and thread, women expressed who they were, even when their voices were not recorded in chronicles. To walk through a medieval village or castle hall was to read clothing as text. Every hem, every hood, every veil, a line in the story of women's lives. From garments that shaped outward appearance, we now turn to the voices within, to the songs, tales, and stories women carried, passing them from hearth to hearth, preserving culture as surely as they preserved food or cloth. In a world where books were rare and literacy limited, storytelling was one of the most powerful ways. Culture, history, and wisdom passed from one generation to the next. And though minstrels and clerics filled halls with tales, it was women around hearths, at cradles, and in fields who kept the threads of story alive in daily life. Their voices carried comfort, warning, and memory, shaping how children understood their world and how communities remembered their past. Evenings in medieval cottages were long and dark, especially in winter. Once the day's work was done and the fire banked, families gathered around the hearth. Here, women's voices filled the silence. Mothers told Bible stories simplified for children, reminding them of Noah's Ark, the flight from Egypt, or the life of Christ. But alongside scripture came folk tales, tales of clever foxes, trickster hares, or enchanted maidens who outwitted danger. These stories were not idle entertainment. They carried lessons about caution, cleverness, loyalty, and faith. A child who learned about a girl escaping a giant also learned the value of wit and bravery. A tale about a dishonest neighbor reminded listeners of the dangers of greed. Storytelling was moral teaching wrapped in delight, woven into the rhythms of family life. Women were also the first singers children heard. Lullabies, often simple and repetitive, soothed restless infants while teaching rhythm and rhyme. Some lullabies included prayers, asking saints to watch over the child. Others contained warnings in soft tones, cautioning children against wandering into woods or against strangers who might cause harm. Through song, women passed on both affection and wisdom, their voices forming the earliest memories of countless children. Storytelling did not end at the hearth. In fields and workshops, women sang while they worked, using rhythm to pace their labor. These songs sometimes told stories of loves won and lost, of battles remembered, of saints who protected against storms. Children working alongside their mothers absorbed not only the tune, but also the lessons hidden within. Marketplaces, too, buzzed with women's voices sharing tales. Gossip carried in stories who had quarreled, who had prospered, who had been blessed with a child. Some tales spread across regions, altered in retelling, but always carried by women's tongues, their role as keepers of community memory firmly established. Many stories preserved by women centered on female figures. The Virgin Mary appeared not only in sermons but in household stories, where she protected families, comforted mothers, or intervened in times of need. Saints' tales, like those of Street Margaret aiding women in childbirth, or Street Bridget bringing blessings to cattle and fields, were told by women who saw their own struggles reflected in these figures. Folk tales, too, often highlighted heroines, maidens who resisted unwanted suitors, wives who tricked cruel husbands, or clever girls who outwitted devils. These tales, told by women, gave voice to quiet desires for agency, justice, and hope. They were not official chronicles, but they preserved a hidden layer of women's perspectives, rarely written down. For noble women, storytelling took different forms. Many were literate, at least in part, and read romances or saints' lives aloud to their households. Ladies gathered with companions to hear tales of knights, quests, and courtly love. These stories reflected ideals of loyalty and chivalry, shaping how noble families understood their roles in society. Yet even here, women added their own interpretations, pausing to emphasize a heroine's bravery or a queen's wisdom. Some noble women even became patrons of literature. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court was famous for encouraging troubadours and poets, while Christine de Pizan wrote works defending women's honor and capability. Storytelling, in these cases, shaped not just households but culture itself. Because so few women wrote their own stories, much of their storytelling is lost to us, yet traces survive. Collections of folk tales gathered centuries later still echo the voices of women who first told them. Proverbs, riddles, and songs recorded in manuscripts reveal everyday wisdom that likely came from women's mouths. Even legal records sometimes include women repeating tales or sayings as evidence, showing how storytelling shaped not only memory, but law and justice. At its heart, women's storytelling was an act of preservation. It kept alive the memory of ancestors, the lessons of faith, and the joys of shared humanity. In a world of uncertainty, where famine, illness, or war could strike at any time, stories gave continuity. A grandmother telling a tale her grandmother had once told reminded listeners that they were part of something larger than themselves, carried across generations through words spoken in firelight. Storytelling was one of the most profound ways medieval women influenced their world. Their voices shaped children, communities, and even culture itself. Around hearths, in fields, and in noble halls, they wove tales that blended faith, folklore, and wisdom. Even when their names were not remembered, their stories endured, echoing in the folk tales, songs, and traditions that still survive today. From the soft voices of women telling tales, we move next to another form of memory: how women themselves were remembered or forgotten in chronicles, wills, and the fragile records of history. For all their labor, devotion, and endurance, medieval women often slip through the pages of history like shadows. Their names are rarely carved into stone, their deeds seldom recorded in chronicles. Yet traces of them survive in wills, parish registers, household accounts, and the occasional chronicle line where their presence could not be ignored. To study women in the Middle Ages is to search for memory where silence predominates, to piece together lives from fragments left behind. Chronicles, written largely by monks and clerics, focused on kings, battles, and miracles. Women appeared only at the margins, queens giving birth to heirs, noble women marrying to seal alliances, or widows founding convents. Ordinary women, whose daily work sustained society, were rarely considered worth recording. Even queens, unless unusually powerful, were reduced to a single sentence: she bore him sons and died. This silence was not accidental. Chroniclers viewed history through a lens of male action, war, and politics. Women's work raising children, managing households, feeding communities was so fundamental it seemed invisible. To them, it was not history, but background, as natural and unremarkable as the rising of the Sunday. Yet the records of law and property tell another story. Wills list women carefully: daughters receiving dowries, widows inheriting goods, mothers remembered with gifts of clothing or livestock. In town courts, women appear as plaintiffs and defendants, defending property, debts, or reputations. In guild records, widows are noted as continuing their husbands' trades, managing workshops, and paying fees. These documents, though dry, reveal glimpses of personality. A widow, leaving her best cloak to a daughter, shows love as much as necessity. A woman suing over a slandered reputation shows courage in a society where women's voices carried little weight. Through such fragments, women step out of shadow, if only briefly. Convents preserved women's memory in yet another way. Necrology's lists of the dead record nuns and their benefactresses, ensuring prayers for their souls. Saints' lives celebrated women whose piety or visions marked them as holy. Hildegard of Bingen, Clare of Assisi, and Catherine of Siena stand as rare examples of women remembered in spiritual history. Yet for every famous saint, countless unnamed women lived lives of faith whose memory was preserved only in the prayers of their children. Religious endowments also kept women's names alive. A woman who donated land or cloth to a church might be remembered in inscriptions or prayers for centuries. In this way, even those outside convents found a place in sacred memory, their acts of charity linking their names to altars and chapels. Perhaps the most enduring form of remembrance came through stories. Women remembered grandmothers' sayings, mothers' lullabies, and neighbors' tales. These oral traditions carried the memory of women not as individuals, but as archetypes: the wise old healer, the patient mother, the clever maiden. Though names faded, the roles endured, shaping how communities remembered women's presence in their lives. Even folk tales sometimes preserved shadows of real women. Local legends of widows who defended villages, midwives who saved infants, or girls who outwitted lords may have been rooted in true figures whose stories blurred into myth. In this way, folk memory offered a counter-history, preserving women's influence where written chronicles failed. For noble women, memory depended on politics. Queens and ladies who bore heirs were remembered in genealogies, their names preserved as links in dynastic chains. Others carved their memory through patronage, endowing convents, commissioning chapels, or sponsoring manuscripts. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, and Isabella of France live in history, not only because of their positions, but because their influence was too great to ignore. Yet even here, memory could be fragile. A noblewoman who failed to produce heirs or fell from favour might be erased, her name glossed over, her deeds forgotten. History remembered women when it suited men's narratives, otherwise it let them fade. Perhaps what strikes most is the fragility of women's remembrance. A garment passed down, a prayer whispered for a soul, a name scratched in the margin of a manuscript. These were small acts of memory, easily lost. Wars destroyed records, time wore away inscriptions, and chroniclers chose what to preserve. For every woman whose name survived, thousands lived and died, unseen by history's pen. Yet their absence does not mean insignificance. Every loaf baked, every child raised, every field harvested was a contribution to the survival of society. Their memory endures not in chronicles but in continuity itself in the families they sustained, the traditions they passed on, the very existence of the generations that followed. Medieval women were remembered in fragments, wills, prayers, folk tales, occasional chronicles, but more often they were forgotten by written history. Yet their lives left indelible marks. They were the foundation upon which households, communities, and kingdoms rested. Even if names fade, their presence endures in the survival of culture, faith, and family across centuries. As we approach the close of this journey, we turn to one final chapter: what legacy medieval women left behind, and how their hidden lives shaped the world we inherit today. As our journey draws to a close, we return to the central thread, the hidden lives of medieval women. For 25 parts we have traced their work, their devotion, their joys, and their sorrows. We have seen them at hearth and field, in castle halls and convent cells, in markets and on pilgrimages, in war and in widowhood. Now, in this final reflection, we must gather those threads into a legacy. What did their lives leave behind? And how do they still touch us today? First, their most immediate legacy was survival itself. Women's labour kept households alive. They sowed seeds, tended animals, spun thread, brewed ale, and preserved food through harsh winters. Without their ingenuity, families would have starved, communities would have collapsed. Every generation that followed was shaped by their unceasing work. In this sense, our very presence is their legacy, for without them, there would be no continuity of life. Women were also carriers of culture. Through lullabies, tales, and songs, they passed on language, wisdom, and moral lessons. They embroidered symbols into cloth, decorated homes with herbs and flowers, and created small rituals of beauty amid hardship. These acts preserved not only survival, but identity. The stories we still tell, the songs that echo faintly in nursery rhymes, the folk traditions that linger in festivals, all bear the imprint of medieval women's voices. In their devotion, women shaped the spiritual fabric of their world. They taught children prayers, tended household shrines, and organized community processions. Nuns preserved learning, wrote hymns, and offered healing within convent walls. Mystics gave voice to visions that challenged and inspired even the highest church authorities. Their faith, expressed in both grandeur and simplicity, remains part of the religious heritage that still resonates today. Though constrained by law and custom, women found spaces of influence. Widows managed estates, noble women guided politics, Peasant women kept economies alive in marketplaces. Their agency was often quiet, sometimes invisible, but it mattered. A noblewoman's decision about a child's marriage could shift alliances. A market woman's skill in trade could keep a family afloat. In countless small ways, they shaped the course of their communities and, indirectly, of history itself. Their legacy is also marked by absence. Most of their names were not written down. Most of their stories went unrecorded. Yet silence itself is a kind of testimony. It reminds us how history has often been told from the top down, preserving kings and knights while forgetting mothers and daughters. To study medieval women is to reclaim what was overlooked, to recognize that absence is not insignificance. The endurance of medieval women still echoes in our lives today. Many of the foods we eat, the traditions we celebrate, and the folk beliefs we carry in memory come from them. The resilience they showed in times of famine, plague, and war reminds us of human endurance in the face of hardship. Their quiet strength, though unheralded, offers a lesson in perseverance, care, and ingenuity. The struggle for women's recognition and equality has deep roots in this past. By remembering their hidden lives, we see that women have always shaped history not as passive figures, but as active participants whose contributions were too often ignored. Their legacy challenges us to tell fuller stories, to honor voices long silenced, and to recognize the unseen labor that sustains societies. And so, as we end this long exploration, picture again the scenes we have visited. A peasant mother by her hearth, stirring pottage, while children sleep nearby. A noblewoman in a cold castle hall, overseeing accounts while a fire flickers. A nun chanting psalms in the dawn light of a convent chapel. A widow in a market, selling bread with firm voice and steady hand. A grandmother telling stories by firelight, her words echoing into generations not yet born. These are the women who carried the Middle Ages forward. Their names may be forgotten, but their presence endures in the survival of families, in the traditions of culture, in the faith of communities, and in the resilience of humanity itself. We owe them more than memory. We owe them recognition.